December 23, 1944, 11:45 hours. From an observation post on Seenamps Hill in Belgium, a German lookout from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division steadied his field glasses. His hands shook slightly as he pressed them to his eyes, witnessing a moment that would forever alter how he saw the war. Around midday, the skies cleared, allowing the first large-scale aerial resupply to take place. Suddenly, 241 American C-47 transport planes appeared, pushing through heavy flak. My God, the sky, it's full of them. Hundreds. This cannot be real. Through his scope, the German watched as wave after wave of transport aircraft filled the Belgian horizon, as if a vast migration had descended. But this was no small group of a dozen or even 24 planes. This was an entire fleet delivering supplies to the encircled 101st Airborne Division. Until December 23rd, poor weather had prevented any resupply. Now, with the skies open, the Americans displayed a mastery of the air that made the Wehrmacht's past victories feel like fading memories. Soldiers of Generalmajor Heinz Kokott's 26th Volksgrenadier Division looked on from their siege positions as parachutes in bright colors unfolded against the winter sky. Red for ammunition, blue for medical supplies, yellow for food, and white for general equipment. The Luftwaffe had not been able to launch an operation of this scale since the defeat at Stalingrad 2 years earlier. Yet here, above one small Belgian town, the United States demonstrated air power greater than anything the Third Reich had achieved at its height. The outcome of the battle was no longer determined by maneuvers or acts of bravery, but by an overwhelming display of American logistics. Hardened German veterans suddenly realized they were witnessing proof of their own nation's impending collapse. The Ardennes offensive had begun with absolute confidence only 7 days earlier. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, the German army opened its attack with a thunderous 90-minute artillery bombardment. Across an 80-mile front, whopping 600 guns fired into American positions. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's final gamble to divide the Allied armies and seize the vital port of Antwerp, initially surpassed all expectations. In the evening of December 15th, the last German units moved into position. In the freezing darkness, soldiers of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division marched along narrow, icy roads through the Eifel. The paths were jammed with troops, tanks, and artillery, each finding their place for the assault. They had been told this was Germany's decisive moment. The Führer himself had designed the offensive, promising that the Americans, weak, spoiled, and unprepared, would collapse at the first blow. In the Ardennes, they faced exhausted troops and inexperienced divisions sent to a quiet sector to rest. Many Germans believed this would be another lightning victory like 1940, when France had been conquered in just 6 weeks. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division was among the spearhead units. Rebuilt after being shattered on the Eastern Front, it was now under the command of Oberst Heinz Kokott. Though the division contained a corps of veterans from Russia and Normandy, much of its strength came from Luftwaffe and naval personnel reassigned as infantry. Still, morale was high. The men were promised new weapons, sufficient supplies, and above all, the element of total surprise. The initial success seemed to prove those promises true. The Americans at first believed this was only a small counterattack. In reality, the Wehrmacht had achieved total tactical surprise. American positions buckled, units surrendered, and others fled west in disorder. The road to Antwerp seemed wide open. By December 18th, German forces were advancing at alarming speed. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, tasked General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz and his Eckselweber Panzer Corps with seizing Bastogne before pushing on to the Meuse River near Namur. The plan appeared simple. 7 major roads converged at Bastogne, making it the central hub for the American supply system in the Ardennes. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the battlefield. Without it, the Americans could not move reinforcements, could not resupply, and could not launch a counterattack. Von Luttwitz organized his attack along a front roughly 7 miles, 11 kilometers wide, with 3 divisions committed. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division and the 2nd Panzer Division would lead, followed by the Panzer Lehr Division. These were seasoned units, veterans of multiple campaigns, supported by some of Germany's most powerful remaining tanks and assault guns. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, in particular, attacked with determination. Its Panzerjäger battalion fielded all 14 of its Jagdpanzer 38 Hetzer tank destroyers, supported by 42 of the reliable 75mm anti-tank guns. This made the division one of the best-equipped Volksgrenadier formations in the Ardennes. They were prepared for American armor, ready for counterattacks and confident of victory. What they encountered instead would be entirely unexpected. As they advanced toward Bastogne, signs appeared that the Americans were not collapsing. Instead of a panicked retreat, U.S. forces conducted a fighting withdrawal, blowing bridges, establishing roadblocks, and making the Germans pay dearly for every mile. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division slowed the advance just long enough for the 101st Airborne Division to reach Bastogne, arriving barely 4 hours before the first German units. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had been resting in Reims, France when the offensive began. Within hours they were rushed to trucks and sent toward the front. Exhausted, undersupplied for winter, and thrust directly into defensive positions, they still arrived in time to secure Bastogne. That timing would prove decisive. By December 20th, German forces had surrounded the town. By noon on December 21st, all 7 highways leading into Bastogne were cut off. By nightfall, both sides understood the situation. The defenders were trapped. Inside the pocket were the 101st Airborne Division, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and other supporting units, about 22,000 men in total. The Americans were outnumbered nearly 5 to 1. They lacked winter gear, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Their senior commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was absent. From the German perspective, this was Stalingrad in reverse. Now it was the Americans who were encircled, cut off, and destined either to surrender or to be destroyed. General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the Encircled Panzer Corps, was supremely confident. In 1940 he had been in France when the British Expeditionary Force was trapped at Dunkirk. He knew what happened when troops were surrounded. Supplies ran out, morale collapsed, and eventually they surrendered. At Bastogne, he was convinced the same fate awaited the Americans. They had perhaps 3 days of ammunition left, maybe 4 days of food if carefully rationed. The bitter winter, with temperatures falling to 10 degrees C, would do much of the work for him. German confidence was so strong that the 2 panzer divisions of the 47th Panzer Corps, after cutting Bastogne off, did not stay to crush it. On December 22nd, they pushed on toward the Meuse River, leaving only 1 regiment behind to help the 26th Volksgrenadier Division take the town. Why waste tanks and fuel on a place destined to fall from cold and starvation? Antwerp was the real goal. Bastogne was just an obstacle that nature itself, the weather weapon winners, would eliminate. From December 16th through December 22nd, the Germans had enjoyed their best ally, the weather. Low clouds, snow, and freezing fog had grounded the feared Allied air forces. For the first time since Normandy, German columns could move in daylight without fear of being attacked by Allied fighter bombers. They could concentrate forces without being detected by reconnaissance planes and attack without the threat of devastating carpet bombing. Inside Bastogne, the situation worsened every day. Some artillery crews had no high-explosive shells left, while others had barely half a dozen rounds. Rations were completely gone, forcing soldiers to scavenge what they could from wrecked vehicles and abandoned depots. Medical supplies had run out, and wounded men were dying from injuries that could have been treated under normal conditions. Then came the ultimatum. On December 22nd, convinced of victory, the Germans demanded surrender. The event played out with almost theatrical formality. At about 11:30 in the morning, 4 German soldiers waving white flags approached the American lines along the Arlon Road from Remo, south of Bastogne. Leading them was Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps, accompanied by Lieutenant Helmut Henker of the Panzer Lehr Operations Section, who carried a briefcase. They even brought blindfolds, certain they would be escorted to the American commander. The surrender note, typed in both German and English, was formal but threatening. It declared, "The fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. More German armored units have crossed the river Ourthe near Orteville, have taken Marche and reached Saint Hubert by passing through Ypres." The letter demanded that the Americans surrender within 2 hours or face total destruction. From the German point of view, it was generous and honorable way out, sparing the Americans pointless loss of life. The reply, however, stunned them. Acting Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a single word. Nuts. The Germans were baffled. Lieutenant Henker had to have the meaning explained by Colonel Harper. If you don't understand in plain English, it means, go to hell. Back at German headquarters, the answer caused shock. Generalmajor Heinz Kokott later admitted in interrogation, "We offered honorable terms. We had them surrounded 5-1, no supplies could reach them. To refuse seemed not brave, but insane." Then came the turning point. On the morning of December 23, 1944, the skies cleared for the first time in a week. German soldiers, frozen from nights spent in temperatures well below zero, stepped from their foxholes grateful for the sun. But soon they heard it, the distant drone of aircraft engines growing louder. At 6:45 a.m., Pathfinder planes took off from Chalgrove, England. At 9:35 a.m., their paratroopers jumped over Belgium, quickly captured by American forces, and set up the beacons to mark the drop zones. At 11:50 a.m., men along the front looked up to see the sight that would define the siege. A formation of 241 C-47 transport planes, flying just 1,000 feet above the ground, appeared in waves. Parachutes of many colors blossomed overhead, each color coded for different supplies: ammunition, food, medical kits, and even whole blood for transfusions. For the Americans, it was salvation. For the Germans, it was the beginning of realizing their miscalculation. German flak batteries scrambled into action. The 88mm guns, the pride of German artillery, opened fire. 20mm cannons rattled, and machine guns added their fire to the sky already filled with black bursts. 14 C-47s were lost, either shot down or too badly damaged to return. Yet for every one that fell, 15 more held formation. Doors opened, dropping cargo into Bastogne. German troops were astonished to see crippled aircraft, engines burning, wings shredded, still stay on course long enough to release their loads. One transport, its tail blazing, flew directly over their positions as the crew shoved out supplies until the final moment before it crashed into the forest. This was more than a supply mission. It was a demonstration of sheer American capacity. The scale of the operation, and the willingness to sustain such losses for a single town, broke German confidence. As one officer admitted after the war, the airdrop at Bastogne was not just a tactical victory. It was proof that they were fighting a nation whose logistical power far outmatched anything Germany could ever muster. The parachutes filled the winter sky like a storm of color, drifting down by the thousands onto the snowy fields around Bastogne. To the trapped paratroopers, the sight was pure relief. But for the German soldiers watching, each parachute was a symbol of despair. This was not the behavior of a desperate army on the edge of collapse. It was the routine display of a military power with endless resources. German intelligence officers struggled to keep up, counting and cataloging what was arriving. Red parachutes carried artillery shells, mortar rounds, and rifle ammunition. Blue parachutes delivered medical kits, surgical tools, plasma, and morphine. Yellow parachutes brought K rations, D rations, and canned goods. White parachutes carried winter gear: blankets, boots, gloves, and coats. Green parachutes contained communications equipment, radios, and spare batteries. Orange parachutes even delivered 5-gallon cans of gasoline. By the end of the day, one American battalion reported having 528,000 rations, along with 250 gallons of gasoline. Their ammunition total stood at H-286, WP-177, and AT-201. And this was only the record of a single unit. Across the entire Bastogne garrison, the amount of material being dropped was staggering, and the resupply did not stop there. What came down in the morning was just the beginning. At 2 p.m., another wave of transports arrived, this time towing gliders loaded with heavy equipment too large to drop by parachute. These gliders brought in 4 tons of supplies, including 2,975 gallons of gasoline. They carried complete surgical teams with doctors, nurses, and operating tables. Jeeps, communications gear, and even artillery replacements were landed. One glider contained nothing but whole blood for transfusions, a resource the German army could not provide even to its senior officers. German medical staff observing through binoculars could hardly believe what they were seeing. While they were improvising with paper bandages, sawdust dressings, and surgeries performed without anesthesia, the Americans were being supplied with refrigerated blood, penicillin, and trained surgical units. The difference in medical capability alone was enough to crush morale. By late afternoon, multiple drop zones had been marked and American transport planes were arriving on schedule like clockwork. The resupply was so fast that artillery crews were firing shells at the enemy that had floated down only minutes earlier. Then came another blow, the return of Allied air power. With the skies clear, P-47 Thunderbolts swept over the battlefield. Flying low and fast, their 50 caliber machine guns hammered German troops, while rockets streaked from under their wings. They attacked supply trucks, horse-drawn wagons, artillery positions, and even small groups of men. Every road became a trap. What had been safe movement for a week turned instantly into a nightmare. German columns heading toward the front were shredded in the open. Vehicles burned, horses scattered, and men dived for cover under relentless fire. The psychological impact was devastating. After days of confidence, the Germans were suddenly reminded of Normandy, where Allied material dominance crushed any chance of survival. Now even single vehicles could be hunted from the sky. By the night of December 23rd, the Germans no longer believed Bastogne would collapse. They had seen with their own eyes a demonstration of overwhelming American industry and logistics. The numbers could not be ignored. If the U.S. could send hundreds of aircraft to risk everything just to resupply one surrounded division, what hidden reserves might they have? If they could drop hundreds of tons of food, fuel, and ammunition in a single day, what was the true scale of their production? Christmas Eve, December 24th, brought new snow and heavy cloud cover. The Germans hoped this would once again ground the American air fleets. Reinforcements arrived. One Panzergrenadier regiment from the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, giving the exhausted 26th Volksgrenadier Division enough strength for a final assault. This was their last chance. They had to capture Bastogne before the skies cleared again. The plan focused on the western perimeter. Lacking the troops for a full encirclement assault, the 47th Panzer Corps prepared a series of concentrated attacks against individual positions. They intended to strike hard from the northwest in hopes of breaking through. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 25th, Christmas morning, the attack began. 18 Mark IV tanks, supported by infantry, broke through the thin defenses of the 327th Glider Infantry, pushing toward Hemrola. For a moment, success seemed possible. German tanks rumbled forward, infantry surged through the breach, and soldiers advanced confidently through the snow. But the Americans struck back with ferocity, using the very ammunition dropped from the skies 2 days earlier. Artillery, bazookas, and tank destroyers poured fire into the German advance. 2 tanks slipped past the initial barrage, but they were soon destroyed by an armored response force dispatched directly from division headquarters. By the end of the day, all 18 German tanks lay destroyed. The following day delivered the final blow to German hopes. On December 26th, Patton's Third Army reached Bastogne. In the fading light around 1700 hours, Combat Command R of the 4th Armored Division broke through from the south, opening a corridor into the town. The first American tanks to enter Bastogne belonged to the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who would later lead U.S. forces in Vietnam. What they found inside was remarkable. The defenders were exhausted but still standing, their confidence unshaken, kept alive by the skies above. Supplied by air, they had endured the siege and were ready to fight on. The records tell the story most clearly. During the siege of Bastogne, according to U.S. Army figures, a staggering bienvenue. In December 1944, the 101st Airborne Division faced the full weight of the German advance at Bastogne. Their survival depended on resupply from the air. On December 23rd, the U.S. launched a massive effort. That day alone, 241 C-47 transport planes carried out the main drop, supported by additional missions. Over 7 tons of supplies and equipment, including 4,900 gallons of gasoline, were delivered by parachute. Another 44 tons with 2,175 gallons of gasoline came in by glider. The following days told a difficult story. On December 24th, operations were limited due to weather. On December 25th, storms made major drops impossible. But from December 26th to 27th, resupply continued, even after the ground link to Bastogne had been restored. By the end of the operation, more than 113 tons of supplies had been delivered by air. This included over 15,000 artillery shells, nearly 8,000 gallons of gasoline, food for 15,000 men, medical supplies for the wounded, and vital winter clothing for the garrison. Now compare this to German capabilities. Around Bastogne, German forces totaled 54,000 men. Inside the town, the Americans numbered just 22,000. German aircraft managed fewer than 100 sorties over Bastogne. By contrast, American aircraft flew more than 2,000 sorties. German aerial supply? Zero. Post-war analysis by German commanders confirmed what their frontline troops had already realized. General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel, who led the 5th Panzer Army, reflected that Bastogne showed the Americans had solved modern warfare's hardest problem: logistics. They could resupply encircled forces by air more effectively than Germany could sustain advancing forces by road. When the weather cleared, their material superiority was so overwhelming that tactics hardly mattered. Generalmajor Heinz Kokott, described by historian S.L.A. Marshall as a quiet scholarly officer, gave perhaps the clearest assessment during his post-war interrogation. He said that when the transport planes filled the skies on December 23rd, every German soldier who saw them knew the truth. They weren't fighting just an army. They were fighting an entire industrial civilization, while armed only with rifles and horses. The shock was visible. When Kokott later met Colonel Harry Kinnard, who had been the G3 operations officer of the 101st during the siege, he could hardly believe it. "Are you sure he was chief of operations?" German General von Lüttwitz asked. "Isn't it possible he was only a regimental officer?" The fact that such a young-looking man had helped orchestrate their defense stunned them. The psychological effect of the Bastogne air supply spread quickly through German ranks across the Ardennes. Soldiers who hadn't witnessed it directly heard detailed accounts from those who had. With each retelling, the story grew, but the central point never changed. America had resources far beyond German imagination. And here lies the bitter irony. By surrounding Bastogne, German forces forced the Americans to prove their resupply capabilities. If they had bypassed the town as originally planned, they might never have witnessed the demonstration of such overwhelming industrial power. After December 26th, German operations around Bastogne degenerated into costly, futile assaults. Hitler still demanded the town be taken immediately. He couldn't accept that a surrounded American division had not only held out but had been supplied so well that it emerged stronger than before the siege. On December 29th, the Germans threw in reinforcements. The 1st SS Panzer Division from the 6th Panzer Army, followed by more units, the 9th SS Panzer, the Führer Escort Brigade, and the 107th Volksgrenadier Division. All of them bled heavily against American lines that were now reinforced and well supplied. The final major German assault began on January 4th. It stalled almost immediately. Time and again, German troops attacked the same positions, suffering heavy losses and gaining nothing. What they had witnessed at Bastogne was only a glimpse of America's industrial might. The Douglas C-47 transport plane became the workhorse of airborne operations, used not only at Bastogne but also in Overlord, Dragoon, Market Garden, and Varsity. Over 10,000 of these aircraft were built. More than 50,000 paratroopers were dropped from C-47s during the war. American factories were producing planes at rates Germany simply could not match. Historians later confirmed that the Bastogne airlift had a decisive psychological impact. German prisoners captured after December 23rd spoke differently from those captured earlier. Before the resupply, they talked about temporary setbacks and the belief that victory was still possible. Afterward, they spoke only of survival and a hope that the war would end quickly. Between December 19, 1944 and January 6, 1945, the 101st Airborne lost 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. Despite being surrounded and outnumbered 5-1, their casualties were relatively light, proof of how effective the air supply had been in keeping them combat ready. The larger lesson was clear. The 101st Airborne would never surrender, because they didn't have to. Their nation could supply them directly from the sky, making traditional siege warfare obsolete. For the German soldiers who saw those 241 C-47s overhead on December 23, 1944, and the waves that followed, the truth was undeniable. They weren't just watching the relief of Bastogne. They were seeing the future of warfare. The arithmetic of American abundance had spoken. And in those numbers was written the fate of the Third Reich. The war would continue for another 5 months, But for those who watched the skies over Bastogne fill with planes, it was already over. Not because the 101st were braver or better soldiers, but because their country would never let them fail. Those transport planes didn't just bring supplies. They destroyed the last illusions of German victory. They showed that America's arsenal was vast, its resolve unshakable, and its triumph inevitable. The German soldiers who witnessed that aerial armada understood something their leaders would deny until the very end. The war had already been decided. And the decision was made in the skies above a small Belgian town, on a clear December morning, when the world learned that the 101st Airborne would never surrender.